At 0330 hours local time, a Ukrainian drone roughly the size of a large television lifted off from a secret launch site in Kherson and surged into the sky. At the same moment, across southern Ukraine, 44 others took off from forest edges, abandoned industrial complexes, and empty fields. What Russia's air defense network, now on full alert, did not know was that most of these UAVs were not carrying warheads. Some were decoy drones equipped with something very special. Meanwhile, the armed UAVs were racing directly towards Saki military airfield on the Crimean Peninsula, home to Su-30SM and Su-24 jets operated by Russian naval aviation. Within minutes, the drone swarm entered Russian-controlled airspace. Russia's Resonance NE radar system immediately came to life. This is a fixed early warning radar that operates on the principle of VHF meter wave resonance. Instead of rotating its antennas, the system uses continuous 360-degree electronic scanning and is specifically designed to detect hypersonic targets and fifth-generation stealth aircraft. This radar network was operating at full strength across the Kherson region and along the approaches to the Crimean Peninsula. Some of the targets generated extremely strong radar returns, enough to make every Su-30 Vityaz combat crew in the area immediately focus its full attention on them. Others flickered in and out of view, like static on a television that had lost its signal. More than 40 targets were detected within the first 12 minutes. Roughly every 20 seconds, another signal appeared, and no one on the Russian side could determine which targets truly mattered. Under standard combat doctrine, the targets assessed as the most dangerous would be destroyed first, even if only half of those large signals were genuine cruise missiles. The entire Kherson region was about to endure a catastrophic night. Interceptor missiles streaked from launchers across the area. 4 batteries opened fire almost simultaneously. The first warhead tore apart a drone traveling at 100 miles per hour at an altitude of 400 feet. A multi-million-dollar interceptor missile had just been used to destroy a decoy UAV airframe made of composite materials. Across 10 different observation screens, 10 Ukrainian control teams were watching the same result. A streak of light climbed into the sky. An explosion appeared, and then the first FP2 disappeared. What had just opened fire? It was the Su-30 Vityaz, Russia's modern medium-range air defense system designed to intercept UAVs, aircraft, and cruise missiles at ranges of up to 80 miles. The 9M96E2 missile it uses weighs 850 pounds, flies at more than Mach 5, and each launcher carries 12 of them. Tonight, those $2 million missiles were chasing FP2s worth only $500, and they were succeeding for only one reason. If you looked at the wreckage of the FP2 that had just been destroyed, you would see a radar reflector attached to its airframe. This small device made the UAV's radar signature appear many times larger on the display, enough to make it look like an incoming cruise missile. The FP2 is Ukraine's medium-range attack UAV, capable of flying 150 miles and carrying a 220-pound warhead. But the 16 drones appearing largest on Russian radar that night were not carrying full warheads. They were decoys. They flew higher, maintained even spacing, and moved in a stable formation. In other words, they were dressed like cruise missiles and knocking directly on the Su-30's front door. The Russian radar saw them and took the bait. In this scenario, the Su-30 battery had 4 launchers with a total of 48 missiles ready. In only the first 9 minutes, 16 missiles were launched to destroy 10 FP2 decoys. Russia had just exchanged 16 air defense missiles for 10 UAVs built for the sole purpose of being shot down. Somewhere in Ukraine, someone was looking at a spreadsheet with the expression of a person who had just bought something at an 80% discount. On the Russian display, 8 large targets disappeared one after another. The Su-350 crew believed they were breaking the attack apart at the outer defensive layer. But while the radar tracked targets that were deliberately making themselves visible, 28 other FP2s were flying low along a different approach. No radar reflectors, no clear formation, and no more signal transmissions than necessary. They moved at an altitude of 180 feet, where their small signatures continuously blended with reflections from the ground, buildings, trees, and power lines. On the radar display, they did not look like an attack. They looked like clutter, like 28 thieves entering through the back door, while 16 people dressed as clowns argued with the security guard at the front entrance. But then, a Russian officer noticed that the numbers did not add up. 16 large signals had been detected, 10 had been destroyed, and 4 were still being pursued. So, why were numerous small tracks previously marked as clutter continuing to move south? One track appeared, disappeared, and then reappeared several miles away. Clutter does not maintain the same direction. Clutter does not fly inside a corridor. And clutter certainly does not move together toward the Crimean Peninsula. The order to redirect tracking was issued immediately. But the Su-350 could not completely ignore the 4 remaining FP2 decoys. No one knew which aircraft carried only reflectors and which might carry real warheads. The Russian radar was forced to divide its attention between 2 directions. That was exactly what Ukraine needed. The FP2s were flying at 100 miles per hour. Every minute of delay allowed them to advance nearly 2 miles. Russia took almost 12 minutes to detect the second attack layer. 12 minutes equaled 26 miles, which might sound like a lot until that was the distance separating a UAV from the air defense layer that had just missed it. The real FP2 formation escaped the first interception zone, descended to lower altitude, and reformed behind them. The final decoys were still keeping the Su-350 occupied. Ahead were the radars, electronic warfare systems, and dense air defense network protecting Crimea. The FP2s updated their flight routes. The formation tightened, and the noses of the UAVs turned south. They had only just begun entering the Crimean Peninsula. Saki Air Base Command immediately received the warning. A small group of targets was flying south through the corridor the Su-350 had just declared under control. Their flight path pointed to only one place: Saki. The FP2 is a medium-range one-way attack UAV produced by the Ukrainian company Firepoint. It flies at 120 miles per hour and carries a warhead weighing nearly 400 pounds to a target 300 miles from its launch point. It is not fast, stealthy, or equipped with a self-defense system, but it carries enough explosives to destroy an aircraft hangar, fuel depot, or command post. The commander recognized the problem and immediately gave the order: scramble 2 Su-30S. The pilot in the front seat flew the aircraft, while the officer in the rear used the radar and electro-optical system to search for the small UAVs flying at an altitude of 200 feet. At this height, the downward-looking radar saw only trees, buildings, utility poles, vehicles, and reflections from the ground. The 2 lead FP2s were flying slightly higher than the rest of the formation and were quickly detected. The first Su-30SM descended, slowed down, and opened fire with its 30mm GSH-301 cannon, tearing the first UAV into pieces. The second continued flying along its pre-programmed coordinates until the other Su-30SM shot it down over a field in northern Crimea. Inside the Russian command center, the interception appeared to be going well. But Ukraine understood that if the formation remained unchanged, the UAVs behind them would also be detected one by one. The order to move to the next phase was immediately transmitted. The 6 surviving FP2 decoys that had slipped past the Su-350 earlier climbed together to nearly 3,000 feet, spread out, and activated their jammers. They deliberately created prominent signals on Russian radar. To Russia, it looked like a mistake. To Ukraine, that was exactly their mission. The two Su-30S immediately changed course and gave chase. But a fighter designed to fly fast struggled to shoot down a UAV moving at only 120 miles per hour close to the ground. If it approached too quickly, the target would disappear beneath the aircraft. If it slowed down too much, the Su-30SM became less stable while flying low in the darkness. The crews switched to the OLS-30 to search for heat from the UAV engines, but vehicles, generators, and residential areas below produced similar signatures. After several attack runs, the two Su-30SMs shot down all 6 decoy UAVs with their 30mm cannons. A total of 8 FP2s had been destroyed, 2 carrying warheads and 6 decoys. Saki command believed the northern corridor had been cleared, but the two fighters had been forced to fly low, reduce speed, make repeated turns, and consume a significant amount of fuel while chasing targets that cost far less. It was like using a Formula One car to chase a lawnmower down a dirt road in the dark. The race car was faster, but speed was no longer an advantage when the target stayed close to the ground and did not care whether it survived. After 2 interception cycles, the Su-30SMs had to climb, check their fuel levels, and return to the airspace protecting the base. The crews believed they had stopped the leading edge of the attack, but the 6 decoys had not climbed to survive. They had climbed to be seen. While the Su-30SMs chased them eastward, the rest of the FP2 formation continued flying low to the west, maintaining its course towards Saki. Not one of them changed direction when the lead UAVs were destroyed. The FP2s continued flying as though the interception had never happened. And Russia's next air defense layer had just realized that the two Su-30S had shot down exactly the targets Ukraine wanted them to shoot down. 10 minutes after entering the airspace over the Crimean Peninsula, the FP2 swarm's telemetry data began dropping out in fragments. The video feed froze, coordinate updates slowed, and then the primary link disappeared completely. If you looked at what had just caused it, you would see a Russian Krasuka 4 system. The system received target bearings from the radar network, then concentrated its jamming on the communication and data transmission channels being used by the FP2S. It did not need to seize control of the UAVs. It only needed to make the signal from Ukraine weaker than the background electronic noise. At the control center in southern Ukraine, telemetry latency increased from a few seconds to more than 30 seconds. An operator sent a new reference point through the primary channel. There was no confirmation. The backup channel did not respond either. At 120 miles per hour, the FP2 had already traveled nearly another mile before the outdated data appeared on the screen. The onboard computer immediately switched to backup mode. Gyroscopes maintained the heading, accelerometers measured movement, and the inertial navigation system continued estimating the UAV's position. A downward-facing camera compared roads, coastlines, and residential areas with a terrain library stored in memory. But without satellite updates, errors began to accumulate. A heading deviation of just 0.2 degrees could cause an FP2 flying for 1 hour to drift more than 2,000 feet sideways. The camera could correct its position when passing over a highway or industrial area, but over the sea, open plains, and the dark fields of Crimea, there was almost nothing to identify. After more than an hour of flying with intermittent communications, one FP2 had drifted half a mile outside its intended corridor. That distance meant little, while the UAV was still over open terrain. But when the target was an aircraft hangar, fuel depot, or command post, half a mile was the difference between a precise strike and an explosion outside the perimeter fence. The Su-24 had not shot down a single FP-2, but it had forced UAVs carrying warheads weighing nearly 400 pounds to continue flying without an operator correcting their course. The Russian side believed the swarm had lost its bearings, but the UAVs did not turn back. They continued towards Saki along flight paths already stored in their memory. After several minutes of flying without satellite signals, the GNSS receivers aboard the FP-2S suddenly came back to life. The signal was strong, stable, and updating coordinates several times per second. Even more accurately than before, the Su-24 began jamming. The onboard computers immediately used the new data to correct the accumulated errors in their inertial navigation systems. According to these satellite coordinates, the formation had drifted east. So the FP-2S banked west together to return to the attack corridor. But what the Ukrainian operators did not know was that the GPS was lying. The UAVs had not reconnected to the satellites. They had locked onto a false GNSS signal transmitted by a Russian electronic warfare system near the approach route to Saki Air Base. This was a more dangerous form of attack because it provided a complete signal and told the computer, "You are right here." In reality, their true position was more than a mile away. Each time, an Naduntsiots FP-2 corrected its course according to the false coordinates, it was pulled several hundred feet farther from the corridor. 2 FP-2s on the edge of the formation were affected first. They repeatedly corrected westward, initially by a few hundred feet, and then by more than a mile, until their flight paths began leading out over the Black Sea. Russia had just removed 2 UAVs from the formation without launching a missile. At the Ukrainian control center, telemetry remained intermittent. However, passive receiving stations noticed that the distance between several emission sources was increasing abnormally. The formation, designed to arrive almost simultaneously, now contained 2 obvious gaps. Then the camera aboard an FP-2 near the center of the formation detected something that did not make sense. A railway line appeared directly below, followed by a wide curve, a cluster of lakes, and the coastline. According to the GNSS coordinates, those landmarks should have been several miles east of the UAV. But the camera was seeing them directly beneath it. The computer compared the images with the stored terrain library. After 3 consecutive mismatches, the system confirmed that the error was not random. The satellite coordinates were pulling the UAV away from Saki. A pre-programmed rule was immediately triggered. When GNSS data repeatedly conflicted with terrain imagery, the satellite signal had to be removed from the navigation chain. The receiver still reported a perfect signal. The computer simply no longer trusted it. The FP-2 switched back to inertial navigation and its downward-facing camera. The railway, lakes, coastline, and industrial areas were used to recalculate its true position. The UAV began banking south. The others detected the same mismatch one by one. One saw highway interchange appear earlier than expected. Another recognized that the coastline was on the wrong side relative to the satellite coordinates. One after another, they rejected the false signal and returned to the attack corridor. The 2 FP-2s that had been pulled too far away no longer had enough time to rejoin the formation. Russia had eliminated them and delayed the raid by several minutes. But the false signal had one weakness. It could change the coordinates on the screen. It could not change the terrain beneath the UAV. The remaining FP-2s tightened their formation, descended to nearly 150 feet, and continued toward the airfield. Behind them, the false GNSS signal remained stable and continued pointing to a position that did not exist. But the swarm was no longer listening. At 04:15 hours local time, the 25 surviving FP-2s reached a point approximately 60 miles from Saki Air Base. The formation flew low over the dark fields of Crimea, maintaining a steady speed and attempting to blend into the ground clutter. But this time, they were no longer completely hidden. The Krasuka-4 had tracked their approach long enough to determine the number, altitude, and speed of the UAV swarm. All of that data was immediately transferred to an S-400 battery on alert ahead of them. The 91N6E radar turned its search sector north. The 8 clearest tracks were quickly locked. 9M96E2 missiles left their launchers in rapid succession, trailing long white streaks of fire across the sky. Only seconds later, 8 FP2s exploded in midair. At the Ukrainian control center, 8 signals disappeared almost simultaneously. The formation was down to just 17 UAVs, and they were still nearly half an hour from the target, with a very high chance of suffering further losses. Ukraine now had only 2 options: continue descending, remain silent, and hope the surviving UAVs could escape the next missile salvo, or activate the digital radio frequency memory electronic warfare modules that had been reserved for the final phase. But DRFM consumed enormous amounts of power. If activated now, the FP2S might get past the S-400. But when they approached the airfield, they would no longer have enough energy to counter the Tor M2S, Panzer S-1S, and the defensive fire zones directly protecting the base. The Ukrainian mission commander made the decision anyway. Activate the DRFM. When the S-400 radar illuminated them, the equipment aboard the FP2S captured each radar pulse, slightly altered its range and velocity information, and then transmitted the modified signal back toward the radar. At first, the Russian radar saw 17 targets. Seconds later, the number rose to 40, then 80. In less than a minute, hundreds of tracks appeared on the screen. Some targets seemed to be accelerating. Some split into multiple signals. Others appeared at positions miles away from the UAV's actual flight path. The S-400 could still see the swarm. But now, each FP2 appeared to be standing inside a room filled with mirrors. The radar operators could no longer determine which targets were real. Each 9M96E2 missile cost approximately $2 million, while the battery carried only 48 missiles, and 8 had already been used. If Russia fired at everything appearing on the screen, it could spend hundreds of millions of dollars and still end up shooting at false signals. The order was issued: stop launching missiles and begin tracking the flight paths of the most stable contacts. It was the safer choice. But every minute of hesitation allowed the remaining FP2s to move nearly 2 miles closer to Saki. The S-400 watched the attack approach helplessly, but it no longer knew where to shoot. 17 FP2s had made it past the S-400, but the electronic protection that helped them do it was beginning to fade. When the formation came within 15 miles of Saki, the DRFM modules started running out of power one by one. The ghost targets on Russian radar disappeared, and dozens of false signals collapsed into 17 real tracks flying close to the ground. And waiting ahead were 2 Panzer S-1 systems. Each system carried 12 5.7E6 missiles and 2 30mm 2A 3.8M automatic cannons. The 1 RS-2-1E fire control radar picked up the formation almost immediately. 4 missiles left their launch tubes. 4 FP2s disappeared. The remaining 13 continued racing toward the airfield. A second salvo was being prepared. If they kept flying straight, the attack could end before a single UAV ever saw Saki's runway. But the formation suddenly dropped even lower. The FP2S began turning left, right, then left again, constantly disrupting the radar's predicted intercept points. They could not outrun a 5.7E6 missile, traveling at more than 1,000 meters per second. They only needed to make the system uncertain about where it should shoot. 4 more missiles came in. 2 still found their targets, and 2 FP2s exploded, but the other 2 encountered UAVs changing direction right against the ground clutter. One target disappeared behind a line of trees, while another reappeared offset from the predicted intercept point. Both missiles flew past. For the first time, some of the FP2s had broken through the Pantsir missile layer. And that was when things became worse. The distance had closed to only a few miles. Both Pantsir turrets lowered, and their twin A-38M cannons opened fire. Nearly 5,000 rounds of 30mm ammunition per minute swept across the approach corridor. The first FP2 was torn in half in midair. The second was hit in the tail, flew for several more seconds, and then crashed short of the airfield perimeter. 2 more FP2s disappeared. If you looked at the problem Ukraine was facing now, it was no longer the S-400, the Krasuka 4, or false GNSS signals. It was just 2 Pantsers. And as long as they remained operational, any FP2 flying through this corridor was simply lining up to be shot down. So the Ukrainian control team decided to act first. 2 FP2s suddenly pulled up to 2,000 feet. Their radar signatures separated from the ground and became so clear they were almost impossible to ignore. Both Pantsirs immediately shifted their attention upward. To Russia, the 2 UAVs had just made a mistake. But they had not climbed to survive. They had climbed to be seen. While the Pantsir radars focused on the 2 targets above, 2 other FP2s broke away from the formation. One curved left, while the other curved right. And this time, they were not flying toward the runway. They were flying directly toward the 2 Pantsers. Each system suddenly had UAVs approaching from different directions. The eastern Pantsir acquired the first target and swung its cannon toward it. A burst of 30mm fire tore the FP2 apart, but the second UAV had used those same seconds to close in from the opposite flank. The turret rotated back. The radar tried to establish a new track. Too late. The FP2 slammed directly into the radar and combat turret area. The explosion engulfed the upper section of the Pantsir, and the 1 RS-2-1E radar disappeared from the screen. On the western side of the airfield, almost the same sequence played out. 1 FP2 was shot down by cannon fire during its approach, while the other appeared from a different direction. The Pantsir rotated its turret. The cannons opened fire, and the rounds passed behind the UAV. Then the second explosion appeared. The 2 radar sources disappeared within only a short interval. No more 57E6 missiles climbed into the sky. No more 30mm cannon fire swept across the approach corridor. The surviving FP2s returned to their original course. Ahead of them was no longer an air defense system, only Saki Air Base, the runway, aircraft hangars, fuel depots, command facilities, and the Su-30S and Su-24S sitting behind the perimeter fence. At 04:24 hours local time, word that the 2 Pantsir S-1 systems had been neutralized reached Saki Air Base. Combat orders were issued immediately. Russian soldiers rushed out of their shelters with anything that could fire into the sky. Some carried Igla man-portable air defense missiles, while others used AK-74 rifles. Near the buildings, Vepr 12 shotguns began firing. From observation posts, 12.7mm cord machine guns continuously swept tracer rounds across the approach corridor. If you looked at the scene now, it no longer resembled a modern air defense system. It looked like the entire airfield was firing into the sky at once. The Iglas searched for heat from the FP2 engines. The cords fired 750 rounds per minute. AK-74s and Vepr 12 tried to fill the gaps at close range, and against a composite UAV with almost no armor, a single 12.7mm round penetrating the engine, fuel tank, or control surface could be enough to end the flight. One soldier locked onto the first FP2 with an Igla missile. The missile left his shoulder, accelerated to nearly Mach 2, and struck the UAV just north of the airfield. It exploded in mid-air. Another made it across the perimeter fence, but was hit in the wing by a burst from a cord. The UAV rolled hard, lost control, then crashed near the end of the runway and exploded. Russia had shot down 2 of them. But that was also the problem. They were already too close. 7 FP2s made it through the final defensive layer. Even if they were hit now, most of their debris and warheads would still fall inside the base. The distance to the aircraft parking area was only a few miles, and the remaining UAVs began their dives. One FP2 locked onto the Su-30SM area. Tracer rounds passed behind it. Too late. The UAV plunged into the parking apron and exploded, completely destroying one Su-30SM and heavily damaging a second, with an estimated value of roughly $35 to $50 million each. Those 2 targets alone were worth more than all of the FP2s used in the final phase. 2 other UAVs shifted toward the Su-24 area. The aircraft could evade missiles in the air, but while sitting on the ground, they were nothing more than metal targets. Explosions and fragmentation struck 3 Su-24s to varying degrees. The final FP2 did not head toward the aircraft. It was flying toward the aviation weapons depot. From the outside, it was simply a low structure protected by blast walls. But inside were bombs, missiles, and aircraft ammunition. The UAV dived into the depot area. The first explosion appeared, then the second. After that came a series of secondary explosions as the ammunition inside began detonating. By the time the gunfire around Saki began to fade, one Su-30SM had been destroyed. Another was heavily damaged. 3 Su-24s had been hit, and the aviation weapons depot was also burning. If you enjoy videos analyzing how UAVs, electronic warfare, and air defense systems confront each other on the battlefield in Ukraine, subscribe to the channel. And in your opinion, which layer of Russia's defenses failed at the most critical moment? Goodbye.